It is a few minutes past 2 in the morning on Sunday, September 8, 1940, and in the small Welsh coastal community of Mumbles on the edge of Swansea Bay, a sound nobody has heard in months tears through the darkness. The bells of All Saints' Church are ringing, not the gentle peal of a Sunday service, but an urgent, uneven clanging, the sound of men hauling on ropes with real fear in their arms. Curtains twitch open along the seafront. Men who have spent the evening on home guard duty grab whatever weapons they possess, shotguns, pitchforks, a handful of ancient rifles, and stumble into the blackout. Somewhere further along the coast, other bells are answering, passing the warning from parish to parish like a chain of fire beacons built 400 years too late, and yet, on this night, exactly on time. For 5 months, ringing a church bell in Britain has been a criminal offence. There is only one reason those ropes are moving now, and everybody standing in the darkness of Mumbles believes they know what it is. The Germans have landed. They have not landed. Not that night, and not on any other night of the Second World War. But the story of why those bells were silenced, what they were built to do the moment they were allowed to sound again, and what actually happened when a nation's oldest technology was pressed into service as its newest early warning system, is one of the strangest and least understood chapters of Britain's darkest year. It is a story about how a piece of bronze cast in a foundry centuries before radar, before radio, before the telephone, became the last line of communication standing between an invading army and the ordinary people of an English or Welsh village. Understanding it means understanding just how close and how frightened Britain believed itself to be. By the summer of 1940, the situation facing the British government was close to unprecedented. France had fallen in 6 weeks. The British Expeditionary Force had escaped from Dunkirk with its life, but almost none of its equipment, leaving the home islands defended by an army that, on paper, looked formidable but in practice was desperately short of tanks, artillery, and trained men. Across the Channel, German forces stood along the French coast from Cherbourg to the Belgian border, and aerial reconnaissance was reporting the steady accumulation of barges in the harbors of Boulogne, Calais, and Antwerp. Operation Sealion, Hitler's plan for the invasion of Britain, existed on paper, and nobody in Whitehall could be certain it would not exist in practice within weeks. The immediate problem was not weapons, though weapons were desperately short, too. It was information, and specifically the speed with which information could travel. Britain in 1940 possessed the most advanced early warning system in the world in the form of the chain-home radar network, capable of detecting incoming aircraft while they were still forming up over French airfields. But radar looked outward, towards the sky and the sea approaches. It said nothing about what was happening on a beach in Kent at 4 in the morning, or in a field outside a Sussex village where German parachutists, real or rumored, might already be cutting telephone wires. The government was gripped, not entirely without reason, by fear of a fifth column. Disguised soldiers, saboteurs, spies signaling to aircraft overhead. Rumors circulated of nuns wearing hobnailed boots and vicars with German accents. Whether or not any of it was true, the fear itself was a strategic problem. Because a population that did not trust its own information, networks was a population that could be paralyzed at the exact moment speed mattered most. The existing chain of communication, the telephone network, relied on exchanges, operators, and cables, every one of which could be cut, bombed, or simply overwhelmed the moment real fighting began. Runners and dispatch riders were fast but finite, and a country covering tens of thousands of square miles could not be blanketed by messengers on bicycles. Radio, too, offered only a partial answer. Wireless sets were still relatively scarce in rural households, and the government was acutely conscious that any broadcast warning could just as easily be picked up and exploited by the enemy. What was needed was something that required no electricity, no operator, no line that could be severed by a single act of sabotage, something that already existed in every parish in the land, was instantly recognizable to every inhabitant regardless of age or literacy, and could be heard for miles across open country, day or night, in fog or in blackout. The solution the government settled on had been hanging in bell towers for centuries. There was, too, a harder military calculation underlying the decision, one that had little to do with sentiment. The south and east coasts of England, the stretch of country most likely to receive an invading force, were dotted with thousands of small farming communities, seaside towns, and isolated hamlets, many of them beyond easy reach of a garrison or a police station. If German troops or parachutists came ashore in one of these places in the small hours, the single most valuable resource the defenders possessed was not firepower, which was in desperately short supply, but time. Time for the nearest Home Guard platoon to reach its position, time for regular Army units held in reserve inland to be alerted and moved forward, time for civilians to be warned to stay off the roads that soldiers would need. Every hour, in some cases every quarter of an hour, mattered enormously to planners who knew that the initial defense of the coastline would fall not to the regular army, still rebuilding after Dunkirk, but to part-time volunteers armed in the summer of 1940, with a mixture of private shotguns, cudgels, and a trickle of obsolete rifles shipped over from the United States. Silencing the bells and reserving them for a single, unmistakable purpose meant that the very first sound many people would hear of a genuine invasion would also be the sound that sent every able-bodied man in the area towards his rallying point without waiting for orders that might never arrive in time. In June 1940, the Ministry of Home Security issued an order, later formalized through the defense regulations, banning the ringing of church bells anywhere in Britain except for one single purpose: to signal that enemy parachutists or airborne troops had actually been sighted, or that invasion was believed to be underway. It was, on the surface, a strikingly simple piece of engineering, in the sense that no engineering was required at all. Roughly 20,000 parish churches across England, Scotland, and Wales already possessed the hardware. A typical church bell of the period weighed anywhere from a few hundred kilograms for a small parish bell to several tons for a great cathedral bell, cast in bronze, an alloy of copper and tin, whose exact proportions had been refined by bell founders for hundreds of years to produce a tone that would carry. The sound of a large bell, struck properly, can travel 10 kilometers or more across still countryside, further than a shouted warning, further than a gunshot, and, unlike a siren, it required no fuel, no batteries, and no mains electricity, none of which could be guaranteed in a country under aerial bombardment. The organizational genius, such as it was, lay not in the bells themselves, but in the system built around them. Home Guard units, auxiliary units, and observer corps posts were instructed that the sighting of parachutists, the sound of unusual aircraft activity at low level, or any credible sign of landing, should be reported up the chain to local military headquarters, and that in the absence of confirmation being possible by telephone, the parish bell should be rung as the signal for surrounding villages to stand to arms. Above this local trigger sat a single secret code word, transmitted from GHQ Home Forces to Army commands covering the length of the eastern, southern, and southwestern coasts. The word that would confirm invasion was believed imminent across the whole country. That word was Cromwell. Bell founders themselves, most famously the Whitechapel Bell Foundry in East London, which had been casting bells since the 16th century and would go on to cast Big Ben, played no direct role in manufacturing anything new for this purpose. The entire system depended on repurposing what already existed rather than building anything fresh, which was itself part of the point. In a period when factories were straining to produce Spitfires, rifles, and ammunition, here was a nationwide alarm network that cost the Treasury almost nothing beyond the printing of instructional pamphlets for church wardens and bell ringers, of whom it is estimated there were somewhere in the region of 40,000 active across the country, most belonging to local ringing societies that had, until the order came into force, spent their Sundays practicing change ringing rather than preparing for war. To understand why this old technology was considered fit for such a modern purpose, it helps to think about what a church bell actually is. Cast as a single solid piece of bronze, its shape is not decorative but acoustic, the thick sound bow at the rim producing the deep fundamental note, the thinner waist and crown shaping the overtones that give each bell its individual character. A bell of even modest size, roughly comparable in weight to a small family car, can produce a sound pressure at close range, not unlike standing beside a pneumatic drill, and that energy, once it leaves the tower, travels extraordinarily well across open, low-lying countryside of the kind found through much of Kent, Sussex, and East Anglia, carrying over hedgerows and fields in a way that a human voice or even a whistle simply cannot. Ringing such a bell was not, in 1940, a job that could be handed to just anyone. Full-circle ringing, the traditional English method in which the bell is swung through a complete revolution before each strike, required trained ringers working in careful coordination, since a bell mishandled could just as easily injure the ringer as sound the alarm. This is part of why the government's instructions relied so heavily on existing ringing societies rather than simply appointing volunteers at random, and why, in the pamphlets distributed to churchwardens, the emphasis was placed less on how to ring the bell, which local ringers already knew perfectly well, and more on the strict conditions under which they were now permitted to do so at all. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. The system was tested, unintentionally and dramatically, on the night of 7th into 8th September 1940. That Saturday had seen the beginning of the Luftwaffe's sustained bombing campaign against London, the opening night of the Blitz, and to the Chiefs of Staff meeting under Churchill's chairmanship, the combination of heavy bombing, favorable tides, and a full moon over the Channel looked uncomfortably like the prelude to a real landing. At 8:20 that evening, the code word Cromwell was transmitted to Eastern, Southern, and Southwestern commands. It was intended purely as an instruction to those specific military formations to move to their highest state of readiness. It was never meant to reach the general public, and it was never meant to trigger the ringing of bells at all, since no parachutists had actually been sighted anywhere. What happened next says as much about the confusion of that summer as it does about the bells themselves. Some Home Guard officers, receiving the word Cromwell without full context and in many cases having only been issued instructions weeks earlier, interpreted it as meaning the invasion had begun rather than merely that it might. In Kent, in Sussex, along stretches of the Welsh coast including Mumbles, and in scattered pockets elsewhere, local commanders rang the bells. In some accounts, roads were barricaded, bridges prepared for demolition, and in one tragic case in Lincolnshire, 3 Guards officers were killed when their vehicle drove over a minefield laid that same night by men who believed, entirely sincerely, that the enemy was already ashore. Records of exactly how many parishes rang their bells that night remain incomplete. Wartime reporting was heavily censored, and the government, embarrassed by the scale of the false alarm, appears to have moved quickly to suppress further detail. So historians today rely largely on individual recollections, local newspaper archives, and regimental diaries rather than any single official tally. By dawn, the confusion had been contained. London was still standing, and there were no German soldiers on any British beach. Cromwell was never issued again. The bells, having rung once in anger for the entire war, fell silent once more, and would remain officially silenced until 1943, when Churchill announced that with the threat of invasion having passed, they could ring out again, now as an instrument of celebration rather than alarm, marking Allied victories including the clearing of Axis forces from North Africa. Set against this improvised, almost pastoral British solution, the German approach to church bells during the same war could hardly have been more different, and considerably darker. Rather than repurposing bells as a defensive tool, occupied Europe saw its bells systematically seized as raw material. Between 1939 and 1945, an estimated 175,000 church bells were taken by Nazi Germany from occupied territories, transported to collection points known grimly as bell cemeteries, the largest at Hamburg, and roughly 150,000 of them were ultimately melted down for shell casings and other armaments. Resistance to this practice took many forms. Parishioners in several countries buried bells in fields or forests to hide them. A Belgian priest reportedly barred the doors of his own church and rang his 15th-century bell in open defiance of the soldiers sent to remove it, and was arrested for his trouble. where Britain saw its church bells as an asset to be conserved and weaponized through silence. The Nazi regime saw the same objects purely as bronze, a metal to be extracted and recast as artillery. The contrast reveals something about the two systems of total war. One nation reaching backwards into its own parish structure to build a warning network on trust and community, the other treating those same communities' oldest possessions as expendable industrial input. There was no meaningful American equivalent, since the continental United States never faced a comparable invasion threat during the war, though it is worth noting that air raid warning networks built around sirens, air raid wardens, and civil defense telephone trees performed a broadly similar function across British cities during the Blitz, working alongside rather than instead of the rural bell system. What made the British bells unusual, and worth remembering today, was precisely their low-technology character in a war otherwise defined by radar, code-breaking, and industrial mass production. It was, in effect, a medieval solution grafted onto a 20th century problem, chosen not because it was elegant, but because it was already there, already trusted, and already capable of reaching every village in the land the moment it was needed. Assessing the actual historical impact of the church bell warning system is, by its nature, an exercise in assessing something that was never truly tested under real conditions, since the invasion it was built to announce never came. Its significance was almost entirely psychological rather than material. It gave millions of people across rural Britain a sense that even the smallest parish far from any radar station or command post had a role to play and a means of raising the alarm. And it gave the government, rightly or wrongly, confidence that no corner of the country could be caught entirely unaware. The events of the night of September 7, 1940 demonstrated both the strength and the fragility of that confidence. The network worked exactly as designed in the sense that bells did ring and communities did respond within minutes, but it also showed how easily a single ambiguous code word, poorly explained down an incomplete chain of command, could spread genuine panic and, in at least one documented case, cost lives through friendly minefields rather than enemy action. Surviving records of the night are scattered rather than centralized. Held today in regional archives, the Imperial War Museum, and local history societies such as those that preserve the Mumbles account. And many of the individual memories that survive come from oral history projects recorded decades later, when the men and women who had been teenage Home Guard volunteers in 1940 were finally asked to describe what they remembered of the night the bells rang. The bells that carried out this duty are, in most cases, the very same bells still hanging in the same towers today, having rung for coronations and funerals both before and after their brief, strange service as Britain's invasion alarm, a use for which they were built for nothing at all, and for which, in the end, they were mercifully never truly required. Return for a moment to Mumbles, to the same dark seafront on that September night, to men standing at their windows with borrowed shotguns, listening for the sound of engines or boots on shingle that never came. Multiply that scene by the hundreds of parishes across the southern and eastern coasts of Britain where the same bells rang, the same men reached for the same makeshift weapons, and the same terrible certainty settled over ordinary people that the war had finally, after a year of waiting, arrived at their own front door. It had not. What arrived instead was a single misunderstood word, traveling down a chain of command still being invented as it went, transformed by fear and good intentions into the oldest alarm system a country could still call its own. No German soldier ever set foot on a British beach as an invader. No bell ever rang to announce a landing that was real. And yet those bells did their job, not because they detected an enemy that was never there, but because they proved, on one confused and frightened night, that a nation could still reach every one of its villages within minutes using nothing more than bronze, rope, and 400 years of tradition. There is a particular kind of history that leaves no medals, no monuments, no roll of honor, because the danger it prepared for simply failed to arrive. The story of Britain's silenced bells belongs to that history. They were built to save villages from an invasion that never came, tested once in the chaos of a single September night, and then returned quietly to the business of marking weddings, funerals, and Sunday mornings, their true purpose known only to the generation that lived through 1940 and, increasingly, forgotten by everyone else.